It's official. The John Means era in Baltimore is over as he signed a one-year deal with the Cleveland Guardians earlier this week. We'll talk a bit about his legacy and why the Orioles chose not to bring him back. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, February 19th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we're going to talk about John Means, who officially signed with the Cleveland Guardians this week, meaning he will not be coming back to Baltimore, the team he debuted with in the big leagues in 2018 and had been with ever since. We'll talk about Means' injury issues over the past few years, his outlook moving forward, and why the Orioles decided not to bring him back to Baltimore. Then we'll talk a little bit about some press conferences that were given on Monday in Sarasota at Orioles spring training. Kyle Bradish spoke with the media for the first time since he underwent Tommy John surgery last June. We got some updates on his health and kind of the decisions him and the Orioles made about when to have him pitch and when to have him have that surgery last year. And then we heard from Orioles owner David Rubenstein for the first time this spring and said some interesting things about kind of how he's been operating the Orioles as he's been in charge for almost a year at this point. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Before we get there, though, just did want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first listen every single day. And just want to thank you for supporting the show. If you are watching here on YouTube, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. If you are a podcast listener, make sure to subscribe wherever you listen. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, leave a 5-star rating and a review if you can. It really helps out the show. And if you have any thoughts on the show, you want to ask a mailbag question, ask any kind of question, give some feedback, you can always email me, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. But let's jump into it here from Orioles spring training. The big news this week, though, was from elsewhere, and that was that John Means is, at least at this point, as I'm recording here on Monday night, I'm not sure the Guardians have announced the deal, but it's pretty much there. John Means is signing a one-year, $1 million deal with the Cleveland Guardians, which means as he hits free agency for the first time in his career, he will not be coming back to Baltimore. Now, we always knew Means would get kind of an interesting deal this offseason because he hit free agency at a bad time, got Tommy John surgery back in June, his second in 3 seasons. Not a great time to hit the market. A guy who was once an all-star, threw a no-hitter, was the ace of the Orioles staff during the rebuild. Probably would have made a lot more money had he been a free agent a couple of years ago, but there's been tons of injuries since then, and now it's a one-year, $1 million deal with a club option for 2026, where Means could make as much as $7.5 million in that next season. Now, why is John Means getting such a low deal? Well, we don't even know if Means is going to be able to throw a major league pitch in 2025. And when I've discussed John Means at times this offseason, I talked about how it was going to be some sort of incentive-laden 2-year deal that he was going to get from a team. Now, technically, this is not a 2-year deal. Technically, it's a 1-year deal with a club option for a second year. But if the Guardians think Means can give them anything coming back from Tommy John, they will most likely pick up the club option for 2026. Now, Kylie McDaniel of ESPN reported on Monday that Means is targeting an August return this year. So you're not getting him for any of the first half. Really, you're going to lose at least 4 months out of the 6 of the season without Means. And that is, of course, targeting August on a perfect timeline. That is no setbacks. And we know Means has had plenty of setbacks already as he is recovering from 2 Tommy John surgeries, specifically in that first recovery timeline. So again, there is a chance he just doesn't pitch this year. And he's got escalators on that club option, so it's not necessarily going to be as much as $7.5 million. Depends on innings pitched and starts and basically how healthy he can stay. But it's been a tough break for John Means. Of course, he had Tommy John surgery in June. I mean, the 12 to 16 month outlook puts him anywhere between next June and next October, right? Like he might not even return for any of the season. And if it goes on the far end and he's not able to pitch this year, or even if, he comes back and makes a couple of starts for the Guardians in September, whatever, like That's going to be 4 consecutive big league seasons for Means where he doesn't make a huge impact. Like, even if he does return to Cleveland to pitch for them at some point in August, I don't think a month of John Means coming off his second Tommy John is going to be enough to make a huge impact for the Guardians. Maybe it will. Maybe he'll do exactly what Matthew Boyd did for Cleveland last season. It's certainly possible. But unless things go perfectly for Means in this rehab, it's going to be 4 consecutive seasons in the big leagues without making much of an impact. He made 2 starts in 2022, then got the Tommy John surgery in May. He then made 4 starts in 2023 because he was supposed to come back mid-season. Then he had a setback in his back, didn't return until September, made 4 starts then, and then was supposed to be on the playoff roster, but then the Orioles shut him down due to elbow soreness, so he didn't even pitch in the postseason. Probably could have been the Orioles' Game 3 starter against Texas. Then in 2024, the Orioles slow played him in the offseason, kind of slow played his beginning to the year. They didn't bring him back till May. He made 4 starts in May and then re-injured his elbow, got Tommy John again in June. And then it's kind of TBD for 2025. Even if he does pitch, it's only going to be a few starts late in the season. That's basically 4 consecutive lost major league seasons. And even if he gets himself fully healthy and is ready to go and is in Cleveland's rotation opening day of 2026, 4 years is a long time to kind of know what you could get from a guy like John Means. And that is a lot of why the Orioles, although the reporting was they had a little bit of interest and certainly had conversations with Means this offseason about potentially bringing him back, it wasn't a lot of strong interest from Baltimore to bring him back. And that's because he's going to be 33 years old by the time he can really give you a full season, if he ever can again. Like, he turns 33 in April of 2026. That's basically when you would expect him to be full John Means again, if he can ever get back to that. He was 28 years old the last time we really fully saw him on a mound regularly back in the 2021 season. That is 5 years of kind of the prime and winding down of the prime of a starting pitcher's career. Like, that is a completely different guy you could be getting whenever he really does return to the mound. So it's not a huge surprise the Orioles did not bring Means back. I had heard a little bit that Means was slightly upset. There were never really any extension talks between him and the Orioles, even before the injury. Obviously, they weren't going to come up as much after he got the first and then the second Tommy John. But it wouldn't have been bad depth for the Orioles to have had they brought him in, thinking maybe they could help him this year. And if not, good rotation depth for 2026. Certainly would not have hated that move. I would have welcomed it. Would have improved the depth on this team, something the Orioles have done a lot of in adding to the roster this offseason. Means would have, I think, fallen right into that category had they brought him back on some sort of variation of a 2-year deal to have him for 2026 as well. But you can see all the reasons why they didn't do it. And also, the Orioles have already made plenty of those depth rotation signings with Tomoyuki Sugano and Charlie Morton, and obviously Cade Povich is rising, and they still have Albert Suarez here, and they have 2 other guys on the same timeline as Means in Kyle Bradish and Tyler Wells. And you could make the argument, I'm not going to say it's 100% right, but you could make the argument that the Orioles see more right now from both Bradish and Wells than they do from Means. They absolutely do with Bradish. You could make the argument they have a better projection for Tyler Wells than they do Means. So he would have been 3rd in that pecking order of guys trying to come back from Tommy John in the second half of the season. It almost would have been like, if Means is healthy, like, it's no use bringing him back, because even though there's no such thing as too much pitching depth, it's like, that could have been too much. Like, where would Means even fit in if he returned in August of 2025 for the Orioles? That certainly would have been a question as well. And the other thing, and the reason why it's tough to bring him back and why he's only getting a 1 year, $1 million deal, that's not even a guaranteed second year. Like, Cleveland could watch his progression come back this year and say, he just doesn't have it. And they could just decline his option and make him a free agent again next year if they just think he's never going to get it back to his old level. That's certainly possible with that deal. And it's telling that Means couldn't even get that guaranteed second year from anyone. It had to be a club option from Cleveland that nobody was even willing to say, hey, we'll give you, 2 years, $10 million, where you make $1 million this year, you'll make $9 million next year when you're healthy. He couldn't even get that. It had to be the club option situation. Tells you teams, not just the Orioles, are very wary about that elbow. And you can't blame him. He had 2 Tommy John surgeries in the span of 26 months. Like, that is not good It's happened before to guys, doesn't happen a ton. Now, plenty of players have gotten 2 Tommy Johns. They're usually a little more spaced out than in the span of just over 2 years. But the guys who have had this kind of situation happen, 2 Tommy John surgeries over the span of 3 seasons. Means had one in 2022, had one in 2024. I did an episode about this back in June when Means got that second Tommy John surgery. I went through all the Tommy John data and broke down guys who had gotten it twice. And there were only, I think, maybe 4 or 5 pitchers who had gotten 2 Tommy Johns in 3 seasons and had come back from the second Tommy John and been an effective pitcher. The biggest name out of that was Cole Reagans, who was one of the best pitchers in the American League, kind of the ace of the Royals staff last year. But Reagans was very, very young. He was in his early 20s when he got both of those surgeries. Means was 29 and 31 when he got those surgeries. And again, is going to be 30, pushing 33 by the time he is fully back. And all, I believe it was either 4 or 5 pitchers that had come back and had success. None of those guys were close to Means' age. All of those guys had gotten the second Tommy John at the latest in their mid-20s. When they came back, they were still 24, 25, 26 and had plenty of arm and games ahead of them. Again, Means is going to come back. Even if he comes back this year, he'll come back at 32. No one on that list that came back with success was even into their 30s. So if Means is going to come back and pitch like the guy he used to be, he would be setting a precedent. He would be the first guy of that age with Tommy John surgeries that close together to come back and succeed in the major leagues. And I'm not saying Means can't do it, because he was great and he doesn't rely on velocity, and that probably helps you when you're coming back from 2 Tommy Johns. But he's got to do something that someone has never done in his exact situation. And that is certainly going to be tough. And I would have been totally fine with the Orioles bringing him back to have some more depth in this organization. I totally understand why they didn't do it. And we know Cleveland is always looking for cheap options and cheap pitching. It's not a super surprise that the Guardians were the team that eventually brought him in this offseason. I understand all of the Orioles' reasons for not wanting to go there, all of the risk involved. There is a chance that John Means is done. Like, there's a chance he tries to come back. He gets on a big league mound with Cleveland late this year. It all looks bad. He doesn't look back. The Guardians decline his option. He becomes a free agent, and he can't find more than a minor league deal next offseason, and he just never slots himself fully back into a rotation again. I hope that's not the case, but it's unfortunately a possibility given the injuries that Means has sustained. But I don't want to leave this on this sour note of John Means, because he meant so much to the Orioles. I want to give him his flowers here before we kind of move on to the next thing in this episode. Like, him being not a top pitching prospect, being an 11th round pick of the old regime, Dan Duquette in 2014, debuting, with his major league debut as a September call-up in 2018, making that terrible 2019 Orioles team as a reliever on opening day, pitching so well the O's had to move him to the rotation because they really had no other options. And what does he do? He gives them 27 starts, a 3.6 ERA, over 3 wins. He was great. Like, he gave the Orioles pretty much everything they were looking for from guys who they were just trying out during the rebuild. I mean, he gave them a great year in 2019, makes the All-Star team, was not as good in the shortened 2020 season, had some injury issues there, but then came back in 2021, makes 26 more starts, 3.62 ERA. Yeah, had some injury issues, but he throws the no-hitter that year in Seattle, which was one of the most magical moments of course, the very, very down years of the Orioles rebuild. And you just kind of look around at the guys who came through the Orioles from 2019 through 2021, and you just think about it. Like, was there anyone who made a bigger impact on the mound than John Means did? I mean, there were certainly some other arms that were somewhat intriguing, but if you look at all the other arms and what they did, you just sort Orioles pitchers from 2019 to 2021. So for that 3-season stretch there during the rebuild, obviously there was the shortened COVID season in the middle in 2020. John Means in that stretch threw 345 and a third innings for the Orioles to a 3.73 ERA. The guy who threw the next most innings for the Orioles in that stretch was Dylan Bundy with 161 and 2/3 innings. Bundy only pitched for the Orioles in that stretch in 2019. After that season, he was traded to the Angels in a deal that got the Orioles Kyle Bradish. Third on that list is Jorge Lopez, who was a reliever for a chunk of that time. Fourth is Matt Harvey. And fifth is Paul Fry, who did it in 140 relief appearances. That was the state of the Orioles pitching staff, followed by Keegan Aiken, Asher Wojciechowski, Gabriel Yanoa, Dylan Tate, Tanner Scott, Thomas Eshelman, Andrew Kashner, Sean Armstrong. Like, these are the guys who were throwing top 10, top 15 amounts of innings for those 3 years. Means through 345. He more than doubled the second place guy in Dylan Bundy. 5.9 WAR according to Fangraphs. Next up was Dylan Bundy at 2.6. Like, this is how important he was. In terms of WAR, the only player who was better than John Means in that 3-year stretch for the Orioles was Cedric Mullins at 6.2 Fangraphs wins above replacement. Means was at 5.9. And remember, Cedric Mullins, for those 6.2 wins, 6 of them came in his 30-30 2021 season. He was a non-factor in the 2 years before that. So if you're looking to stretch it out in longevity, like you got Trey Mancini at 4.4 wins, Jonathan Villar at 3.4, Austin Hayes at 2.9, I don't think it's crazy at all to say John Means was the best player of that 3-year stretch, kind of the darkest time, the rebuild of the Mike Elias rebuild years, which was 2019, 2020, and 2021. Because in 22, they didn't make the playoffs, but they had a winning record. They kind of pulled themselves out of the rebuild. And although 2018 was terrible, that was not under Mike Elias. So of the 3 Mike Elias rebuild years, the best player on the Orioles in that stretch, and the stats back it up, was John Means. And you got to give a shout out and appreciate what he did in that stretch for this Orioles team. And it just, the timing of the injuries was terrible. The fact that he pitched so well and he gets injured at the beginning of 2022 when the Orioles eventually turn it around, and he comes back in 23 and you're like, they're winning the division. He's going to pitch in the postseason, and then he gets shut down. And then he comes back for 24. You're like, he's finally back. He's going to pitch for this postseason team. And then another Tommy John pops up. He never gets to throw a playoff game. Really, he never threw a lot of high leverage starts. Like, yeah, he made 4 starts in September of 2023. That was some high leverage stuff, but the Orioles were not wrapping things up, but it's not like they were going to Means as their ace in those spots. He really never got that feeling outside of those 4 starts. And I feel bad for him. Like, he was such a big part of this rebuild. And the guys that also were, like the Cedric Mullinses and the Anthony Santander's and the Austin Hayes, and even a little bit of Trey Mancini before they dealt him in 22. And hey, Trey got dealt to the Astros and won the World Series that year. So he got that ring out of it. Like, a lot of those guys stayed around and got the payoff. And while Means was on the roster and with the team and got to experience a lot of it, he was not able to be on the mound with those guys. And that stinks. And I want him to be able to come back with Cleveland, and hopefully, Cleveland is a playoff team in 2025 and Means is healthy at the end of the year and he's pitching in the postseason for the Guardians. I want nothing more than that for John Means. I want to see him in the playoffs because he has earned that. But the timeline just stinks when he got injured. But you got to appreciate it. Like, let me put it in the comments here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page, your favorite John Means memories. It was just, he really was. He was the bright light of those 3 years of the rebuild. Like, there was John Means Day. It was a real thing. You could get excited every 5 days when John Means was taking the ball. You were not excited for the other 4 days and whoever was taking the ball for those Orioles teams. And I'll always remember John Means for doing that in Baltimore and salute him for his time with the Orioles. But speaking of an Orioles pitcher coming off Tommy John, it was more positive updates from one of them. We heard from Kyle Bradish for the first time in a while on Monday. Break down some of his comments when we come back. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Wonderful Pistachios. You're looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Well, crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Now, personally, I like the classic pistachios. I like cracking open every shell, get the satisfying crunch. Feels like I'm working for my food. Maybe it's a Maryland thing, an Eaton Crabs thing, but I want to work for it a little bit. But you know what? They have a no shells variety too that comes in multiple flavors. It can be a great snack on the go as well. So get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. So from John Means, we move on to Kyle Bradish, who is still with the Orioles and is still signed through 2028. Bradish, who is also coming off of Tommy John surgery, spoke to the media on Monday in Sarasota at spring training for the first time since he had that surgery. Now, had the surgery in June, and Bradish has already said, he is confident he is going to return to the mound for the Orioles this season. And that is certainly a great sign for the O's. Bradish, who had the surgery back in June, usually your timeline for that, as I talked about with John Means, somewhere between 12 and 16 months. So we shall certainly see. 12 months would put him in June, 16 months would put him in October, with the season basically over. So you kind of just don't know. There's certainly a chance that Bradish does not pitch for the Orioles this year. It's not out of the question. There's a chance that when the All-Star break ends and the O's come back to playing in July, that Bradish is back in their rotation. That's a possibility too. It all depends on what his rehab is going like. And so far, Bradish said Monday that he is all on track. He's feeling good. He's not throwing bullpens, but he's throwing on flat grounds, and he is fully on track in his recovery. Now, I would assume he's targeting something like an August return to this Orioles team here in 2025, but you just kind of never know with a timeline at this point. We'll start to learn it as we get deeper into this season. But while it was great to hear that his rehab's going good, he hasn't had setbacks, he's confident he's going to pitch this year, those are all great things. Bradish was a true ace, fourth in AL Cy Young in 2023, could come back and be the ace the Orioles no longer have with Corbin Burnes signing with the Diamondbacks. Him and Rodriguez could finally be a great 1-2 punch in this rotation again at the end of this season. But I thought what was more interesting that Bradish talked about was when he was asked about the decision to hold off the surgery last year and then eventually get it. If you don't remember the specifics of it, basically Kyle Bradish had something happen, something didn't feel good in his elbow in January when he was ramping up his throwing last year. It was some sort of UCL injury, but the severity was not quite yet known, and it didn't look so severe that they immediately had to get Tommy John surgery. The options were getting TJ or going with the PRP injection in the elbow and then going with rest. It's something that many pitchers have done before and some with success. And Bradish chose that path. And something that I think was new that we learned from Bradish on Monday when speaking to the media is that he was actually feeling some of that pain late in the 2023 season when he was pitching well, when he started game one of the ALDS for the Orioles that year. He was feeling some pain, and he's made it seem like he was feeling some similar pain starting in January of the next year. But because he had pitched through it and pitched well through it the year before, he thought, hey, it's not much worse. I think I can still pitch through this like I did last year. Let's get the injection. Let's get some rest, and let's start up my season. He didn't miss much time. He returned to the field in early May for the Orioles, and he looked just as good, if not better, as he did in that amazing 2023 season. He posted a 2.75 ERA in 8 starts for the Orioles in May and June. He looked like classic Kyle Bradish, but then he made a start in mid-June on a Friday night in Baltimore against the Phillies. The velocity was down. He didn't look right, and that was it. The Orioles shortly after placed him on the injured list, and shortly after that announced that he needed to undergo Tommy John surgery, which he got in June, and basically said he was pitching through the pain, and the pain got worse and worse, and they decided to eventually go ahead and get the surgery. Now, there's been a lot of debate about this because there's a side of Orioles fans that is, hey, if Kyle Bradish feels healthy enough to pitch, he's so good, put him out there, we'll take who we can get and hope he can avoid surgery. There's been another subset of people who say you should have gotten the surgery in January when you felt the injury. If everything went right, and he did that, he could have been ready for opening day 2025. Would have missed the entirety of last year, but could have potentially been ready for opening day, and if not, very early in this 2025 season. And right now, that would put the Orioles in a better spot because they'd have a lot more Kyle Bradish, who might be an ace for this season with Corbin Burnes gone. And I kind of fall somewhere in the middle of those two arguments, but it was interesting to hear Bradish's thoughts on it for the first time. And Bradish talked about, and it was a good kind of recap of this in the Baltimore Banner on Monday, but Bradish talked about how he felt like he would have regretted it had he gotten the surgery in January, because he liked how he pitched in those 8 starts before the injury became worse and he had to be shut down. But he basically said that he would have regretted it because we always would have wondered, could I have pitched through this? Could I have pitched well? Could I have helped this team in 2024. That kind of seems to be the gamer mentality that Kyle Bradish has. And there's not many bigger Kyle Bradish fans in the world than the host of this podcast right here. And I like that he had that mentality. And he tried to get back out there and pitch, and he did the best he could for his team for 8 starts. And both sides, both the Orioles medical staff and Bradish, were clearly okay with going the injection and rest route and trying to get him back on the mound. And they did for a little bit. It just didn't work out in the end. And that's generally going to be the case. We talked about it this time last year. Like, usually when you go that route, you can hold off Tommy John, but it always comes for you. And that, of course, is what happened for Bradish. I'm happy he made those 8 starts. It stinks that we don't have him for much of this year. So I'm kind of two minds on this one. But at the end of the day, like, I would love for him to pitch this year. I hope he does come back maybe in August and give the Orioles a burst in their rotation at the end of the year. But pitching injuries happen, and it kind of is what it is. What happened to him last year, it happens to a lot of pitchers getting Tommy John. But just know that even if he's got his sights set on, coming back early in the second half for the Orioles this year, the O's are going to be cautious. They're going to err on the side of caution because he is, I think right now, their best starting pitcher that they have on their roster. He is still under contract through 2028. That's even if he doesn't pitch this year, he'd still have 3 more seasons in Baltimore before becoming a free agent. And the Orioles are going to prioritize that long-term health and having Bradish fully ready and rocking in 2026. It doesn't mean he won't pitch this season. He absolutely could, but they're going to be cautious with it. So just keep that in mind. It is not a guarantee at all that Bradish throws any innings for the Orioles this season. It's not off the table that he would be out for the entirety of this year just to play it safe and just to be on the timeline of a Tommy John. Like, it takes the 16 months. He's not pitching this year. So just be aware that is certainly a possibility, but it was nice to hear from Bradish and hear that everything's going well and he is confident he will pitch for the Orioles this season. But Bradish wasn't the only guy who spoke with the media on Monday. David Rubenstein also did so, and I wanted to kind of discuss his comments, break them down a little bit to finish off the show. That is coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by SelectQuote. In sports, having a winning strategy is everything. It's how the best teams make it to the Super Bowl, the World Series, and the Olympics. And the same goes for life. Having a strategy like life insurance from SelectQuote can protect your financial legacy and keep your family's future secure. SelectQuote makes it easy to find the perfect life insurance policy. As one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, they've helped over 2 million customers find $700 billion in coverage since 1985. And what sets SelectQuote apart is their personal touch. Unlike other brokers that offer one-size-fits-all policies, their licensed agents tailor coverage to fit your unique needs. And listen, it's more affordable than you think. You can get up to $1 million in coverage for as little as $20 a month. So get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/lockedon. Go to selectquote.com/lockedon today to get started. That is selectquote.com/lockedon. SelectQuote. They shop, you save. So let's finish things up here with some comments from David Rubenstein, the Orioles owner, on Monday in Sarasota. First time he had spoken to the media during spring training. And really nothing groundbreaking that we heard from Rubenstein. He's a fairly public figure. He's talked multiple times this offseason. It's not like we don't hear from him at all. But what he said on Monday, which was covered well by the Baltimore Banner, is kind of falls into place with how I see this organization operating at the moment. Like, it wasn't a lot of big surprises. I know people are going to take out some of the quotes and be happy about them, get mad about them, whatever it may be, but it kind of falls in line with what we've seen. Like, it wasn't anything super shocking or surprising that he said. Kind of his big key points was, number one, he's very focused on improving the business side of the team. He brought in Katie Griggs to handle all those business operations. She's done a great job so far. He wanted to overhaul that, and the Orioles have already done a better job there. He said there's really no budget right now. Like, there's not a lot of money constraints. Money's not a problem. We figured that would be the case with how freaking rich he is. He said he would love to keep the young players around forever. He mentioned Gunnar Henderson and Adley Rutschman, how he had lunch with them the other day. Yeah, of course he would like to keep them around. They're amazing players. They're all-stars. Everybody would like to keep them around. And finally, he basically said he leaves the baseball decisions to Mike Elias, which is something we knew, something he has talked about multiple times, and something that doesn't surprise me because he's going to be in contact with Elias, but not really going to meddle in the baseball parts of the decision. Now, he said he's been in contact with Mike Elias multiple times every day throughout the offseason. I think that's probably the case. I'm sure they're talking all times. Elias is working the phones and trying to make moves. And this is kind of what we assume. Like, David Rubenstein has the money. He's open to spending the money, but he's not giving Elias directives on how much money to spend or how to spend that money and on what players. And he's deferring to Elias in terms of the baseball decisions. He's saying, hey, this money is here, but I will let you make the calls baseball-wise. And that's what Rubenstein's pretty much been saying from the get-go. Maybe he laid it out in more exact terms on Monday, but that's what we've kind of known since he took over around opening day of last season. And as we've gone through this offseason, on the flip side for Mike Elias, and for legitimate reasons, as annoying as they can be sometimes, he does not philosophically want to give out long-term big money deals to especially starting pitchers just because there is so much risk involved. And Rubenstein did talk a little bit about that risk on Monday as well, and talked about guys, you give out 6, 7, 8-year deals to pitchers. At the end, back half of that deal, they're generally not healthy, not performing well. And that's not for every one of those deals, but it is the case for a lot of them. And you know where the Orioles and Mike Elias are coming from in making these decisions to not give out the big deals. And they were players with Corbin Burnes. They were players with Blake Snell, but they were clearly not willing to go to the amount of years and money that took for the Diamondbacks, for the Dodgers to sign those two guys this offseason. It's nice to at least be players with those guys. They were certainly not when John Angelos was in charge. And Angelos was saying things like, if we're going to extend guys, we're going to have to raise all the prices. Rubenstein's like, no, we have the money and I'd like to do it. And we'll see from there. That's much better than it was with Angelos. That's a lot of things across the board with David Rubenstein, but it is still kind of aggravating, right? That the Orioles haven't made that move. Like, it's great to know that Rubenstein is not imposing spending limits on Elias. It's also great to know he's not really meddling in the baseball stuff. That's certainly what got Peter Angelos in trouble when he was owning the Orioles, and apparently wasn't the only thing that got Peter Angelos in trouble. Good story at the Banner about the FBI investigating him a couple of times, which is an interesting read. But it's just annoying that Elias doesn't want to give out that big pitching deal. And you get it, right? You understand the thinking behind it. A lot of those deals do not work out. It's so risky. Pitching in general is so risky because pitchers just get injured so often at this point. And to give them that much money for that many years can hamstring a franchise. And if Rubenstein's saying money's not an issue, then maybe it won't hamstring you as much. You should be a little more willing to give out those deals, but you still understand where Elias and the Orioles are coming from. That doesn't mean it's not aggravating. Like, a lot of teams think that way about long-term pitching deals. The Orioles are not alone. But at some point, you do have to give out a long-term deal. And at some point, to go get the true ace and have him be around for a while, you just have to overpay. Like, you look at the Dodgers and the Yankees in the World Series last year, giant contracts for Yamamoto. Flip side for the Yankees, giant contract for Garrett Cole, even kind of big contracts for guys like Carlos Rodon. Like, they have been willing, even guys like Marcus Stroman, who didn't really help them, but they've been willing to give out that big money to pitching. Tyler Glasnow for the Dodgers. Of course, they went out and got Blake Snell this offseason. The Yankees went out and got Max Fried. They're looking to get back to the World Series. Even the team, or some of the teams they beat, like the Mets were in the NLCS, the big money to guys like Zach Wheeler. You have the Phillies in there with Zach Wheeler, but the Mets giving out big money to some of their other starters, obviously giving out big money to Juan Soto, but you have the Phillies in the mix all the time with Zach Wheeler and Aaron Nola. And you have these teams that, yeah, they know the risk, but are still willing to give out the big money to make sure they have an ace. And the Orioles pitching development is getting better and better, and there's more and more guys getting to the top level of the minors. And we know that how good Kyle Bradish and Grayson Rodriguez could be in this next group of guys coming in as well. But I feel like if you're going to win a World Series, you're going to have to just bite the bullet and just pick one guy to give that money out to. And I thought it should have been Corbin Burnes. The Orioles were moving uphill in that when he clearly wanted to be in Arizona and play for the Diamondbacks. I think Blake Snell could have been a guy that fit that well. But at some point, and there'll be some big names available next offseason, Dylan Cease, Framber Valdez, among others, you're going to have to find that guy at some point. And if that's not going to be the case, you at least got to dish out the money for these extensions to keep these guys around. And it's nice that Rubenstein talked about wanting to do that on Monday. But, and again, it's two sides, but the player has to be willing to do the extension too. But at some point, you just got to put pen to paper and you got to make it happen. And Rubenstein is generally saying the right things, and the Orioles are, operating a little timidly. I'd like to see them take more risks. It seems like Rubenstein is giving Elias the financial flexibility. If he wants to take a risk, he's just a little risk averse and maybe a little too risk averse as a GM. And we will see at this deadline or next offseason as this plays out. And Rubenstein is the owner for longer and longer. But at some point, I've said it, like, I'm not flippantly mad that the Orioles don't throw out all this free agent money left and right. They have such a good young core, but at some point you have to bite the bullet on somebody to raise the ceiling of this team and get them to that next World Series level. And Elias just hasn't been willing to do it. And we'll see if that pitcher does come along. But it's nice to know that Rubenstein is giving him the green light. And, Elias wants to build his team his way. And so far, he's done it well. They've won a lot of baseball games. Haven't won in the playoffs yet. They've won a lot of baseball games. And so it's just time will tell. But you can be of two minds. You can get why the O's aren't giving out the big contracts and also be annoyed by it because at some point you got to pull the trigger. That's kind of where I feel at this point. Let me know in the comments how you do, but it's just interesting to see Rubenstein be a little more candid about his team than Angelos was and have him talk to the media at spring training. But that'll do it for today's episode. We are back tomorrow because, of course, we're back to 5 days a week. Might potentially have an evening episode on Thursday instead of a morning episode, so keep your eyes peeled on the podcast page and the YouTube page here for all of that information. But back Thursday either way. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.